My name is Samuel Caldwell. I am 68 years old, a retired surveyor who spent his life measuring the ground beneath other people's feet. I thought I had built a solid foundation for my son Daniel. But 3 days before Christmas, he called to tell me there was no room for me at his table, in the house my money had bought. I didn't argue. I just hung up the phone and made a different call. Not to the bank that held his mortgage, but to the lawyer who held the truth. Before I tell you what happened when the bank statement arrived at his $1 million home, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. And please like this video and subscribe if you believe that respect is not a gift, but a debt that must be paid. The call came while I was in my workshop. It's a small corner of the garage in my apartment complex, but it's mine. The scent of pine filled the small space, a clean, sharp smell that always calmed me. I was sanding a small wooden train engine, a Christmas gift for my 6-year-old grandson, Liam. The wood was warm under my fingers, the grain slowly smoothing out under the patient motion of the sandpaper. It was quiet work. Honest work. My phone buzzed on the workbench, rattling against a jar of screws. I saw the name Daniel on the screen and smiled. I picked it up, wiping a bit of sawdust from the screen with my thumb. His voice was bright at first, the way it always was when he was about to ask for something. He asked about my week, about the weather, the usual dance we did before getting to the point. I told him I was fine, that I was just finishing up Liam's gift. There was a pause, a silence just long enough to feel heavy. Then he said it. "Dad, about Christmas. It's going to be a little tight this year." I waited. I knew the language of engineers and builders, of contracts and property lines. I did not speak the language of excuses. He continued, his voice losing its artificial brightness. "Jessica's parents are flying in from Florida, and the house is just going to be bursting at the seams. We want to have a quiet one this year. A quiet one." The words hung in the air between us, thicker than sawdust. He was saying my presence was noise, a complication, an inconvenience in the grand, quiet life I had financed. I looked down at the wooden train in my hand. The engine, half sanded, looked like a promise broken. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue or demand an explanation. A surveyor doesn't argue with the terrain. He simply notes its features. "I understand," I said. My voice was even, level. He sounded relieved, stammering a quick "thank you" before finding a reason to end the call. I set the phone down. I picked up the small engine and placed it carefully on the shelf. Then I took the canvas cloth I used to cover my tools and draped it over the unfinished train. I turned off the light, leaving the workshop in darkness, and walked to my truck. I drove. I didn't have a destination. The city blurred past the window of my old Ford F-150. Every traffic light, every stop sign felt like a memory pulling me backward. 5 years ago. My wife Sarah had just passed. The house was so quiet then, a different kind of quiet. A hollow quiet. The life insurance check sat on the kitchen table for a week. It wasn't a fortune, but it was the sum of a careful life. Her life. Daniel and Jessica came over for dinner. They sat at that same kitchen table, their faces arranged in masks of sympathy. They talked about their cramped apartment, about wanting a better school district for Liam. They talked about a beautiful house they had seen, a house with a big backyard. "Mom would have wanted this for Liam," Jessica had said, her voice soft and persuasive. They weren't just describing a house, they were building a cage of familial duty around me. I was grieving and lonely, and all I wanted was to keep what was left of my family together. I agreed. Of course, I agreed. The drive took me past the tall glass building where my lawyer David Chen had his office. I remembered that day clearly, too. The smell of leather and old paper. David had been my friend for 30 years. He looked at me over his glasses as he explained the documents. I was setting up a family trust. $400,000. The bulk of my savings and all of Sarah's insurance money. $150,000 for the down payment. The rest, $250,000, would be placed in the trust, with me as the sole trustee, to make the $2,800 mortgage payment directly to Bank of America every month, for almost 8 years, a bridge to get them to a future where they could stand on their own. David had pointed to a specific paragraph. "This clause, Sam, it's your anchor," he'd said. "It says this whole arrangement is built on a good faith familial relationship and mutual respect. It gives you sole discretion. It says this is built on something more than money." I had nodded, never imagining a day would come when I would need to check the strength of that anchor. My drive ended at a small park overlooking a lake. The water was gray and choppy under the winter sky. For 5 years, every decision I made was guided by grief and a desperate need to honor my wife's memory. I thought that by giving my son a home, I was keeping her spirit alive. But sitting there in the cab of my truck, I realized I had been honoring a ghost while being disrespected by the living. I had been paying for the house, but I had lost my place in the home. The surveyor in me took over. I looked at the situation not as a father, but as a man assessing a piece of land. The boundaries had been violated. The agreement had been broken. The structure was unsound. The grief was gone. In its place was a quiet, cold geometry, a problem waiting for a solution. I started the truck and drove home. I knew exactly what I needed to do, or rather, what I needed not to do. The door to my apartment closed with a quiet click, a sound that sealed me off from the rest of the world. My home isn't large. It's a 2-bedroom unit that overlooks a small courtyard. It is the opposite of the house I pay for, the one with its sprawling lawn, open-concept kitchen, and a mortgage that costs more than my entire annual property tax. Daniel's house is filled with things. Mine is filled with memories. The armchair by the window is where Sarah used to read, the fabric worn smooth in the shape of her presence. The photos on the mantel are not of perfect smiling people in matching sweaters, but of genuine moments. Liam's first steps on a scuffed kitchen floor. Sarah laughing on a boat, her hair a mess in the wind. Every object here has a purpose, a story. It is a home built on a foundation of shared life, not a line of credit. I walked to the kitchen and put the kettle on the stove. The simple ritual was grounding. It was a sequence of familiar actions in a world that had suddenly become unfamiliar. I was not a guest here. I was not an inconvenience. I was home. After the tea had steeped, I carried the warm mug to the bedroom closet. In the back on the floor was a small, fireproof safe. I knelt down, the sound of my knees cracking, echoing slightly in the enclosed space. I spun the combination dial, the tumblers falling into place with a series of soft clicks that I knew by heart. The sound was precise, mechanical. The heavy door swung open. Inside there was no cash, no jewelry. There were only documents, each in a neatly labeled folder. My birth certificate. Sarah's death certificate. The deed to this apartment paid in full. And one thick file, thicker than the rest, with 2 words written on the tab in my own block printing, Caldwell Family Trust. I lifted it out. It felt heavier than it should. I carried it to the small wooden desk in the corner of my living room, the one I had used for decades to review survey maps and legal descriptions. I placed the folder down, sat in my chair, and took a slow sip of tea. The time for driving and remembering was over. The time for reading and deciding had begun. I opened the folder. The crisp scent of legal paper filled the air. I didn't need to search for the document. It was right on top. I began to read, not like a father, but like the surveyor I had been for 40 years. I examined every line, every clause, every piece of punctuation. I was searching for flaws not in the document, but in myself. And I found them. I found the foolish optimism of a grieving husband. I found the desperate hope of a lonely father. I saw a man so terrified of his family shrinking that he had paid a premium to keep a version of it that wasn't even real. He had bought the house but not the home. He had paid for the table but was not offered a seat. My eyes stopped on Article 4, Section B. I read the words silently at first, then I whispered them aloud to the quiet room. The disbursement from this trust is predicated upon the maintenance of a good faith familial relationship and mutual respect. Good faith. Mutual respect. The words felt like stones in my mouth. What was good faith about a phone call designed to push me away? Where was the mutual respect in being told there was no room for me? For 5 years I had held up my end of this contract. I had provided the funds, the stability, the foundation. I had acted in good faith. And in return, my son had treated that faith as an entitlement. He saw the money not as a gift from a father, but as an asset he was owed. He had forgotten that the trust was built on something more than numbers in a bank account. It was built on a promise he had just broken. I reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a yellow highlighter. The plastic tip was new sharp. I didn't hesitate. I pressed the marker to the page and drew a clean, straight line under that entire clause. The highlighter made a soft, whispering sound against the paper. It was the sound of a line being drawn, a boundary being reset. The chapter of silent sacrifice was over. A new one, a chapter of quiet correction, was about to begin. I picked up my phone from the desk. My thumb hovered over David Chen's name in my contacts for only a second. There was no hesitation. I pressed the screen. It rang twice. His voice was exactly as I remembered, calm and without surprise. "David," I said. "It's Sam." There was a brief pause, not of confusion, but of acknowledgement. "I know, Sam," he said, his voice laced with the weariness of a man who had seen this story play out 1,000 times. "I've been waiting for this call for a few years now." I took a breath. "It's time," I said. The line was quiet for a moment, and then he replied. "My office. 1 hour." He hung up. There was nothing else to say. David's office was on the 3rd floor of an old brick building downtown. It wasn't a place of glass walls and chrome furniture. It was a place of books. Floor-to-ceiling shelves crammed with legal texts, history books, and novels. It smelled of old paper and freshly brewed coffee. It was the office of a man who dealt in facts, not appearances. On a side table, there was a framed photo of him and me 20 years younger, holding up a ridiculously large fish on the deck of a boat. He was already sitting behind his large oak desk when I walked in, a copy of the Caldwell Family Trust spread out before him. He had known exactly what this was about. He motioned to the chair opposite him and pushed a freshly poured mug of black coffee across the desk toward me. Legally, he began skipping all pleasantries. "You are on granite. The language in Article 4 is as clear as a surveyor's mark. Sole discretion means what it says. It's your judgment and yours alone. The trust was established on a condition, and you are the only one who can determine if that condition has been met." He leaned back, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "But that's the legal side, Sam. Now let's talk about the human side, the messy side." He put his glasses back on, his eyes sharp and focused. "They will not take this well. When the payment doesn't arrive, Daniel will panic. He might get angry. He might get desperate. He could try to sue you. It would be a frivolous lawsuit, but it would still be a lawsuit. It would cost you time and money. It would be ugly. Are you prepared for that?" I took a sip of the hot coffee. It burned slightly, a good clean pain. "Let him," I said, my voice steady. "What would he claim in a court of law, David? That his father is refusing to continue paying his $1 million mortgage as a free gift? What damages would he claim, that he has to take responsibility for his own life? I have every bank statement, every transfer record. For 5 years, I have fulfilled my part of the agreement. The question for the court would be simple. Did he fulfill his phone call 3 days ago is the only answer anyone would need." David nodded slowly, conceding the point. "All right. So the standard procedure here is to send a letter. A formal notice of breach of terms sent via certified mail. It informs them that they have violated the conditions of the trust, that you are ceasing payments, and that you are reserving all your legal rights. It's clean. It's professional. It puts them on notice. He picked up a pen ready to make notes on a legal pad. I held up my hand. No, I said. He stopped the pen hovering over the paper. No letters. No certified mail. No warnings at all. David looked at me, a flicker of concern in his eyes. Sam, that's not how this is usually done. A warning shot is... I cut him off, my voice still quiet, but now with an edge of steel. A warning shot is a form of help, David. It's a way of saying, I'm about to do this, you should prepare yourself. It would be me one last time managing his life for him. It would give him a target to argue with. It would open a negotiation. I am not negotiating. I am teaching. And a lesson is only learned when you feel the full consequence of your own actions. I leaned forward, placing my mug down on the desk. For 5 years I have sent money. Now I will send nothing, not even information. I will send silence. Let the bank send him a letter. Let the late fee notice be his first warning. Let him wonder, then worry, then panic. Let him scramble to figure out what's wrong. He needs to experience this not as an attack from me, but as a direct result of a choice he made. The silence is the point. It's the entire strategy. Let the silence do the work. David stared at me for a long time. He looked from my face down to the document, then back again. He saw not an angry father, but a methodical surveyor who had found a fatal flaw in a foundation. He finally let out a long breath and set his pen down. All right, Sam, he said, his voice now firm with resolve. We do it your way. Let the silence do the work. Christmas Day arrived not with the sound of carols, but with the quiet hum of the furnace in my apartment. I did not spend it alone. I spent it at the downtown community center in the basement of an old church. The air inside wasn't filled with the scent of pine needles and cinnamon, but with the rich, savory smell of roasting turkey and coffee. It was the smell of necessity, not luxury. I put on a plain white apron and took my place behind a long stainless steel serving line. For the next 3 hours, I was not a father or a surveyor. I was just a pair of hands. Hands that ladled gravy, placed slices of turkey onto paper plates, and passed them to other hands, some trembling from cold, some wrinkled with age. There was no performance here. No one was trying to impress anyone else. The conversations were simple, direct. A woman with tired eyes thanked me for the extra spoonful of mashed potatoes. A young man who couldn't have been more than 20 asked if there was any more bread. I found him a fresh basket. The most I spoke was to a man named George, an Army veteran, with a quiet dignity about him. He sat by himself, slowly eating his meal. I took the seat across from him when my shift was over, a plate of my own in front of me. We didn't talk about the past. We talked about the surprisingly mild weather. He told me the turkey was cooked just right. I told him I agreed. When he finished, he looked me in the eye, nodded once, and said, "Merry Christmas." I said it back. In that simple exchange, there was more mutual respect than I had felt in years. It was a connection that asked for nothing. It was clean. After the last plate was cleared, I stayed to help wipe down the long folding tables. The work was simple, the satisfaction profound. I had served a purpose. I had been a part of something real. I was not lonely. Driving home through the empty city streets, I allowed myself to picture the other Christmas. The one I was not invited to. I could see it perfectly. The towering tree in Daniel's living room, dripping with professionally coordinated ornaments, standing in the exact spot where my armchair used to be. They had replaced a person with a decoration. It was a perfect metaphor. I was no longer a part of the family structure. I was an ornament they had decided to leave in the box this year. I could hear the sounds, the brittle laughter of Jessica's mother, the booming voice of her father as he described his latest round of golf, the clinking of champagne glasses, The dialogue would be a parade of brand names and destinations. I could almost hear Daniel, eager to impress his father-in-law, saying, "Did you see the new Tesla dealership on the highway? We're thinking of upgrading." Jessica would chime in, "And we're thinking of vacationing in Aspen this winter." Their words were not conversation. They were advertisements for a life they were struggling to afford. I imagined my son's face, the practiced smile stretched tight across his jaw, his eyes holding the faint, hunted look of a man who knows he is living beyond his means. He was the master of a house he did not truly own, celebrating a holiday about togetherness, with the one person who had held his life together cut out of the picture. And I thought of Liam. I imagined him wading through a sea of expensive plastic toys, his attention shifting from one to the next, the joy of receiving already fading. None of them would last. None of them held a story. On my workbench under a canvas cloth sat a simple wooden train engine sanded smooth by my own hands, waiting for a final coat of paint. It was a gift that was meant to be kept, to be passed down. A piece of his grandfather. A piece of his family's real foundation. But he would never receive it. He was being given things, so many things, but he was being denied value. As I pulled into my quiet garage, I felt a deep and profound sadness, not for myself, but for my son who was so busy buying a life that he had forgotten how to live one. The plan I had set in motion was a simple one. It did not require me to make a single phone call, write a single letter, or take a single action. It only required me to do nothing and to wait. The first ripple of that silence reached my son on January 2nd. I pictured him in his home office, a room I had only seen once but could imagine perfectly. The sleek, minimalist desk, the two large computer monitors, the ergonomic chair that probably cost more than my entire living room set. He would have been in the middle of a video conference, nodding along to a presentation, projecting the image of a man in complete control. He was good at that, projecting an image. Then his phone lying face down on the desk would have vibrated, a soft, insistent buzz, an unwelcome intrusion of the real world into his carefully curated digital space. He would have ignored it at first, but the persistence of the notification would have forced his hand. A quick, subtle flip of the wrist. I can see the screen lighting up. The preview of the email. The sender, Bank of America. The subject line, a cold, automated string of words, payment alert. Your mortgage payment is past due. I can see the change in his face, a transformation that would have been invisible to anyone on the video call. The confident, engaged smile would have tightened at the edges. A flicker of irritation, of pure annoyance, would have flashed in his eyes before being quickly suppressed. Confidence is a fragile thing. It only takes a few words on a screen to turn it into a problem that needs to be managed. An hour later, my own phone buzzed. I was in my kitchen reading a book. I saw Daniel's name on the screen. I did not answer. I let the call run its course, and then I waited for the voicemail notification to appear. This was part of the process. I was in control of the flow of information. He was not. Later, while sipping my evening tea, I listened to the message. His voice was clipped, the forced politeness of a busy man delegating a task he found irritating. There was no concern, no. "Hey Dad, is everything okay?" There was only assumption. "Hey Dad, it's Dan," the recording said. "Listen, the bank sent some automated email saying the mortgage is late. It's probably just a glitch in their system, but could you give them a call and sort it out? Thanks. Bye." Sort it out. As if it were my mess. As if I were his assistant. I listened to the message twice just to fully appreciate the depth of his condescension. Then I deleted it. It was a data point, nothing more. A confirmation that the first stage of the plan was working exactly as I had designed it. Later that night, I'm sure the topic came up again in that vast, silent kitchen of theirs. I can see Jessica, her brow furrowed with a genuine anxiety that my son was incapable of feeling. She was always more perceptive of the fragile foundation upon which their perfect life was built. She would have been the one to voice the question that Daniel refused to consider. "Did you hear from your father?" She would have asked, her voice a little too quiet. Daniel, likely pouring himself a glass of wine that cost $100, would have shrugged. "I left him a voicemail. He'll handle it." But Jessica wouldn't let it go. "Dan, what if it wasn't a glitch? What if he's doing this on purpose?" The question would hang in the air between them, sharp and dangerous, and I know exactly what my son would have said. I can hear the dismissive little laugh, the sound of him waving away a possibility too ridiculous to entertain. "Don't be ridiculous," he would have said, swirling the red wine in his glass. "He's 68, Jessica. He probably lost his checkbook or forgot what day it is. It's not a statement. It's just old age." He would take a sip, confident in his own assessment. "Don't worry," he would conclude, his voice dripping with the arrogance of a man who has never been truly challenged. "I'll handle him. Handle him." That was the phrase that likely sealed his fate. He didn't see me as his father. He didn't see me as the man whose life savings were the bedrock of his own. He saw me as a problem to be managed, a faulty appliance, a doddering old man who needed to be herded. My quiet nature he had always mistaken for weakness. My patience he had mistaken for passivity. He had no idea that a surveyor spends his entire life studying the quiet, unmoving ground beneath his feet, learning to recognize the subtle signs of an impending collapse. He thought he was standing on solid rock. He was about to find out he was standing on a fault line. 5 days passed in silence. A quiet, heavy space in which the seeds of consequence began to sprout. I imagine my son spent the first few days in a state of controlled irritation, checking his bank account, blaming the holiday backlog, certain that my forgetfulness or a simple bank error would resolve itself. He was wrong. The second email would have arrived not as a gentle nudge but as a fire alarm. I can picture him at his sleek desk attempting to focus on work when the notification appeared on his screen. The subject line would have been impossible to ignore, written in the stark, urgent language of financial institutions. It would have been in all caps, possibly colored red. "Urgent, your mortgage is in default." This message would have contained the words that people like my son fear most. Not words of emotional betrayal, but of financial ruin. Words like late fees assessed. Words like grace period expiring. And then the two words that would have felt like a physical blow, credit bureau reporting. To Daniel, a credit score was more than a number. It was a measure of his success, a validation of his entire identity. The thought of that number being damaged would have been a threat to his very sense of self. The annoyance would have instantly curdled into pure, cold panic. And that is when the storm broke. The first wave was anger. My phone began to buzz on the kitchen table, a frantic, insistent vibration. I did not move to pick it up. A text message appeared on the lock screen. "Call me." A few minutes later, another. "What are you doing?" I let the calls go to voicemail. The first message was clipped, furious. "Dad, I don't know what game you're playing, but it needs to stop. You're messing with my life. Call me back now." Then Jessica started. Her texts were a masterclass in passive aggression. "Sam, I hope you're okay. We're very worried. The bank has sent another notice and it's quite serious. It would be a shame for a misunderstanding to affect our family's future. Our family's future." She meant her future, her credit rating, her house. For the next 2 days, my phone was no longer a tool of communication. It was a vessel for their escalating panic. It was a constant barrage, a digital siege. The screen was a waterfall of their desperation. Missed call from Daniel. Missed call from Jessica. A text from Daniel. "This isn't funny anymore. Pick up the phone." A voicemail from Jessica, her voice tight with rage. Do you have any idea what you're doing to us? After everything we've done for you, letting you be a part of our lives, the irony of that statement was so profound, it was almost beautiful. Then, as the reality set in that I was not responding, the anger began to crack. And what lay beneath it was not concern or confusion, but the raw, primal fear of a child who has lost his safety net. The tone of the voicemails began to shift. The demands turned into pleas. The anger in Daniel's voice was replaced by a tremor he could not hide. "Dad, please, call me. I don't understand. Just tell me what's going on." And then finally the message that told me the foundation had crumbled. His voice was small, broken. "Dad, I'm begging you. I don't know what I did, but I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry about Christmas. I'm an idiot. I'm sorry. Please, just make the payment. We can talk about anything you want. Please." And through all of this, my own world remained perfectly still. The storm was raging inside my phone, but in my apartment, there was only peace. I spent that afternoon tending to my houseplants. I moved each one to the sink, carefully watering the soil, wiping the dust from their leaves with a damp cloth. My phone sat on the counter beside me, buzzing and lighting up relentlessly. It was a frantic, angry insect flinging itself against the glass of a jar, unable to reach me. I could feel its electronic rage, but it had no power over me. This was not revenge. Revenge is a hot, messy emotion. This was an observation. I had set up an experiment in consequences, and now I was simply noting the results. I felt no joy in his panic, but I felt no pity either. He had built his house on a foundation of disrespect, and I had simply removed the artificial props that were holding it up. Now he was feeling the true weight of his choices for the very first time. I looked at the phone buzzing with his desperation. Then I looked at the thirsty leaves of my fern. It needed water to live. I gave it what it needed. After the last voicemail, the one where his voice finally broke, and the anger was washed away by a tide of pure panic, the silence from my end must have become an answer in itself. A definitive no. That is when the fear would have finally boiled over into rage. Not rage at me, because I was an immovable object, a locked door. It would have been rage at each other, the desperate, frantic blame that erupts between two people who know they are trapped. I can picture them in that $1,000,000 kitchen, the cold gleam of stainless steel and marble reflecting their panic. The stage for their perfect life had suddenly become a courtroom. Jessica would have started it. Her anxiety always sharpened into accusation under pressure. Still nothing, she would have asked, her voice thin and brittle. Daniel, staring at his uselessly silent phone, would have shaken his head, and the dam would have broken. "I told you this was a bad idea, Dan," she would have hissed. "I told you pushing him out was a mistake. My son, a man whose pride was as inflated as his mortgage, would never accept responsibility." He would have turned on her, his voice low and venomous. "This is because of your stupid idea to uninvite him," he would have spat. "You and your parents wanting the house all to yourselves," and she would have fired right back, the truth finally coming out, sharp and ugly. "My idea, you agreed to it in a second. You couldn't wait to play the big shot, the man of the house with no father looking over your shoulder. You loved the idea." They would have circled each other in that vast kitchen, hurling insults that were really just confessions. Every word would be a reminder of their shared greed, their mutual complicity. This is what happens when a partnership is built on ambition instead of affection. Under pressure, it doesn't bend. It shatters. They weren't a team solving a problem. They were two co-conspirators trying to pin the entire crime on the other. The argument would have ended not with a resolution, but with the exhaustion that comes from realizing there is nowhere left to turn. The only option left was the one they had been avoiding. A final, desperate act of surrender. They had to come to me. There are many kinds of silence. The silence I had given them was one of strength, of certainty. It was the silence of a mountain of a deep river. The silence in their luxury SUV as they drove to my apartment, as I imagined, it was the silence of defeat. It was a vacuum heavy with unspoken fear and frantic calculation. They would have sat side by side staring out at the blur of the city, but their minds would have been racing, each preparing for the coming confrontation, each devising a separate and flawed strategy. My son would be rehearsing anger. His pride, though wounded, was still his primary motivation. He would be planning a performance of righteous indignation, preparing to storm into my apartment and demand an explanation, to accuse me of betrayal. He would believe that aggression was the only way to reclaim the control he had lost, that by raising his voice he could somehow make himself big again and me small. He would be preparing to fight the weak, forgetful old man he had convinced himself I was. Jessica, on the other hand, would be practicing a different performance, the performance of contrition. She is smarter than Daniel in that way. She understands that a different key is needed for a different lock. She would be rehearsing tears in her mind, planning a speech full of soft-spoken apologies and carefully crafted remorse. She would try to appeal to the father, the protector, the sentimental fool she believed was still somewhere inside me. She would try to wield my love for my grandson like a weapon to shame me into submission with a twisted performance of familial love. They sat in their shared silence, but they were not together. They were each preparing to face a different man. Daniel was preparing to fight a ghost. Jessica was preparing to manipulate a memory. Neither of them, not for a single second, was prepared to face a surveyor who had already measured the depth of their disrespect and found it to be absolute. They were not driving to a negotiation. They were not driving to a family meeting. They were driving to a final binding reading of the property lines they had so arrogantly crossed. And as their expensive car finally pulled up in front of my modest, unremarkable apartment building, the sheer difference in scale would have been the first of many humiliations to come. They were on my ground now, and the ground was firm. The banging on my door was not a knock. It was a frantic, desperate summons, the sound of people who had lost all control. I walked from the kitchen, my steps measured and even. I was in no hurry. When I opened the door, they stood there, disheveled and wild-eyed, looking like survivors of a wreck. And they saw I was not alone. David Chen stood slightly behind me, calm and composed in a dark professional suit, holding a leather folio. My son's eyes flickered from my face to David, and in that single instant, the storm of anger on his face was replaced by a flash of pure, cold confusion. This was not the ambush he had planned. This was a hearing he had been summoned to. I stepped back and gestured them inside. They stumbled in, bringing the chill of their panic into my warm apartment. Daniel found his voice first, a torrent of practiced outrage and genuine fear. "What the hell is this, Dad?" he demanded, gesturing at David. "What is he doing here? Are you trying to ruin us? How could you do this to your own family?" Jessica, taking her cue, began her performance. Tears welled in her eyes as she spoke, her voice trembling. "Sam, please. We're your family. Think of Liam. How could you do this to your own grandson?" They threw words at us like stones, a chaotic barrage of accusation, guilt, and sentiment. They were searching for a weakness, a crack in the wall they could exploit. David and I remained silent. We did not react. We simply stood there, two pillars of calm, and let them empty themselves. We let the storm blow itself out until all that was left in the room was the sound of their own ragged breathing. Only then, when the silence was absolute, did I speak. "Please," I said, my voice quiet but filling the room. "Have a seat." They looked at the two armchairs, then at me, and hesitantly sat down. I remained standing. I gestured to the file on the coffee table, a copy of the one from my safe. "This is not about ruining you, Daniel," I began. "This is about clarifying the terms of a broken agreement." I spoke with the precision of a surveyor reading a legal description. For 5 years, I have honored every detail of the Caldwell Family Trust. The purpose of that trust, as you know, was explicitly stated. I will quote from Article 4, Section B. Its function was predicated upon the maintenance of a good faith familial relationship and mutual respect. I let the words hang in the air. On December 22nd, at approximately 4:15 in the afternoon, you called me and unilaterally declared that condition void. You informed me that there was no room for me in your home, in our family's home. You ended the agreement, Daniel, not me. I am simply acknowledging its termination. I saw the dawning horror in their eyes as the logic cold and inescapable settled in. But I was not finished. However I continued, I did not let your choices ruin your credit. I contacted the bank this morning. The overdue mortgage payment and all associated late fees have been paid in full. Your record with the bank is clean. I saw it then. A flicker of hope in their faces, a rush of relief. They thought they had won. They thought the old soft man had caved in at the last moment. But I said, and that single word erased their relief, the payment was made as part of a final transaction. As per my rights as sole trustee, the Caldwell Family Trust has been legally dissolved. Its assets have been liquidated. The remaining principal on your mortgage, $285,400, has been purchased. The bank has transferred the debt. Daniel's face was a mask of confusion. Transferred, he whispered. To who? I picked up the new folder from the table, the one David had brought. I slid it across the polished wood. It came to a stop directly in front of them. It was a new legally binding loan agreement. To me, I said, and my voice was as hard and flat as bedrock. The debt doesn't disappear, Daniel. It simply changes hands. From now on, you answer to me. The color drained from their faces. The shock was absolute, leaving no room for anger or tears. There was only the blank, hollow look of total and complete defeat. I looked at my son, the man who thought he could handle me, and I saw a lost child. I turned away from them then. The first payment is due on the 1st of next month, I said, walking toward my kitchen. David will show you where to send. The new order had been established. Not with a shout, but with a signature. True family is a covenant built on mutual respect, not a one-sided transaction. When that bond is broken, protecting your dignity is not an act of revenge, but of necessary correction. The most profound lessons are taught not with anger, but with the quiet, unavoidable weight of consequence. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. For more stories about finding strength and restoring balance, be sure to like this video and subscribe.